So, Megan, I've been wondering, are we actually depressed or are we just feeling burnt out? I know you've been doing a little bit of research into this topic, which is why we decided to talk about it today. So, I'd love to know what your research showed.
To lay the land before we get into it, a few stats that I kind of found when researching. First one is that 51% of young Aussies say that burnout is negatively impacting their well-being. Numbers two is 83% of frontline workers are experiencing burnout. The highest group of that is 20 to 29-year-olds. Number three is that 44% of Gen Z said that they've needed time off because of stress, but not that same amount took the time off. And then we've seen a rise in mental health by 54% from 2007, and these stats were from 2022. So COVID probably maybe wasn't the reason for this rise as well, or maybe a contributing factor, but not what we can put it down to. And then lastly, only 25% of people within this cohort have said that they have a healthy relationship with work and enjoy being at work. So that's a really low number. I mean, if we go back to the question that you've asked, when we think about burnout and being depressed at work, I know when you first moved over to Brisbane, you have maybe a story about work and feeling those kind of feelings. And then, I mean, it might be worth for the listener as well to define what burnout is, because I think this is where the correlation, there is a bit of a confusion because people aren't able to see what the difference is.
So, from those stats, it's actually quite alarming. So, this is clearly a relevant topic for us to talk about today. And here on the No Censorship podcast, we're all about giving real conversations, real space. So, to help answer this question and the topic moving forward, let's actually look at how burnout is defined. So, burnout is a state of emotional, mental, and physical exhaustion brought on by repeated stress. And based on that definition alone, I do have an example that I'm happy to share. In the last episode, I talked about the job that I had that got me to Brisbane and how unfortunately I was let go. What I didn't share was how relieved I was that I did end up letting go, because that role was the most stressful and burned out I've ever felt. So, to paint the picture, I started the job while I was in Canberra before I had moved to Brisbane. And I remember on my first day, I was in a meeting where they were talking about my priorities and where my role's going to be tailored towards. And within the first hour, they mentioned that during the period of when I'll be moving to Brisbane, I'll need to fly to Darwin and do a presentation with two of my other colleagues who I was yet to meet. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, that wasn't mentioned in the job interview because this is quite close to when I'm going to be moving to Brisbane. And at that point in time, I just had a window of when I was moving to Brisbane, but I didn't have a signed lease date yet. So I mentioned that to them and I said, the Darwin date's actually clashing with when I'm going to be going to Brisbane. I'm not sure when my lease is going to be signed yet. Is there any flexibility around these dates? And they said, no, we decided to tell you this now so you can plan around it. And I said, okay, when you start a new job, you're obviously going to be really optimistic and hopeful. So I said, no worries. I'll take that into consideration and I'll try my best to plan around it. It wasn't until I got home and started talking to my partner about it that I just felt so stressed, because when you do sign a lease, you don't really get a choice on what you're actually moving in. The real estate agent will tell you you're moving in on this date, and unless you can move in on that date, tough luck. The rental market's so competitive, someone else will just snatch it up. So that was kind of the first red flag. Without going into too much other detail, I was overworked to the core. The managers that I was working with, they would start their day at 4 o'clock in the morning. So they said to me within the first week of starting there, we have a meeting at 6 a.m. every day. It's non-video committal. All you need to do is just join it. Are you happy to be a part of that? And I felt obliged to, because what am I going to say on the first week? No, I don't want to join your meeting. And I was really young. To give context, I was only 22 at the time. So I didn't have a lot of work experience and I didn't know how to set clear boundaries. Now, that time difference in Brisbane is an hour behind. So when I get to Brisbane, I'm starting this meeting at 5 o'clock in the morning and it was awful. And I just remember being so overworked and so stressed. And I ended up going to Darwin. I ended up getting sick, as I've mentioned. But during that period, I was working from pretty much 5 o'clock in the morning to sometimes 7, 8, even 10 o'clock at night some days. So when it did eventuate and the job didn't work out, yeah, I was bummed. And, it was the lowest point of my life for what I mentioned in the first episode. But that burnout is something I've never experienced before and thankfully never experienced since. Throughout this episode, I'd love to talk about how people can navigate burnout and if you yourself have any other examples that you'd be willing to share.
Yeah, I mean, I think from what I can hear from what you said, and I mean, obviously, I was around during this time when you went through this, but something that I've found was that there's probably two main common factors or causes of burnout. So, number one being heavy workloads, which I think something you just spoke to in your story. And number two, which is interesting and probably an obvious one, but insufficient staffing. So people don't have enough staff, they don't backfill, you double hat maybe because you do internal moves. So I think all factors that maybe cause it. I think for the listener as well, what might be important is the symptoms, just because sometimes, like I said before, it's really hard to identify what is it and whether you're going through it. So some of the things that I found probably from our personal experience as well, and then research too, is a few symptoms is emotional exhaustion, detachment from work, fatigue, reduced performance, which if you are feeling any of these things, potentially could put it down to the fact that you are a bit burnt out and honestly demotivated from work. What's interesting about burnout as well is that someone who hasn't experienced any mental health or, any kind of issues in that area, workplace burnout can actually trigger them a lot more than they think it could, and more than someone who already has pre-existing health conditions. And that's just because they haven't put in or they're not across how to deal with this kind of stuff when it happens. I mean, I think that we live in a world where workplaces make it seem like doing extra hours or overtime is the bare minimum. I mean, I know sometimes in previous jobs that I've had, it's, I hope you're not working overtime, but then it's clearly obvious I am. And there wasn't any, oh no, you need to stop that. It's kind of like, oh, well, sometimes you got to put in extra hours and you got to. And I think now maybe I'm just conditioned to think that's actually normal. So if I do need to put in a couple hours after work here and there, I think, well, it's just normal, but it's not. It's not. You're not contracted to do more than 9 to 5 or whatever it is, 8 hours in your contract. For a lot of us, that is also going above your pay grade, right? Maybe the people who are more senior in the company, I'm talking CEO and a couple levels down or general manager and a couple levels down. Yes, they get paid to put in those hours. They get paid to know all that information. So maybe in some of those instances, yes, they need to give and take, right? So work a little bit more one side of the spectrum, and then maybe they get a bit of flexibility on the other side. But I think when it comes to a lot of these jobs that particularly this younger demographic and Gen Z group in, they are going into those entry level jobs or potentially those, starting off manager jobs where it shouldn't be an expectation for you to do that. I mean, I don't know about you and your experience, but do you feel like there's a cutoff at 5 p.m. where you clock off, or is there an expectation that you're working a little bit more than you should?
Yeah, I think you've made some really good points there. And I think we can dive a little bit deeper into the expectation versus reality of your role. And this is something where as you naturally progress in your career, you will be able to identify what's suitable behavior and what's not suitable behavior. So when I reflect on my own personal roles, and thankfully now I'm in a really positive workplace where if there is a busy period, it's push and pull. So if you do have times where you have to work outside of normal 9 to 5, 8 to 4 working hours, you can take that time off your week when you're free. So when there is a slower period, there's no one breathing down your neck saying, why are you leaving early? It's just this unspoken expectation that when you're busy, you've got a job to do, get the job done. When it's not so busy, we can be a little bit more flexible. And I think this is the approach to working that more workplaces and agencies actually need to adopt because it's more beneficial for the employee. And at the end of the day, your employees will work harder for you and for your company if they feel like they're respected and treated well. So I know the difference for us is I'm at a not-for-profit, you're in a private for-profit business. Do you feel as though the workplace is treating you fairly?
I mean, I think to your point just then is I do work at a place that is quite flexible. It's, clock on at a certain time. And if you do need to go to an appointment or go to the gym or whatever it is, do stuff outside of work, it's like a give and take. And you might put in hours outside of work. But I think where maybe my view might is a bit controversial on that or something I like to challenge is flexibility killing it and making burnout worse, or is it helping it? And the reason I say that is because when you have a routine that is 9 to 5, 8 to 4, whatever it looks like, is it better to know that you've got those 3 days in the office or 5 days in the office that are those strict hours? And then as soon as it's 4 p.m., you clock off. I don't know if being flexible is helping it because then you go, oh, well, I'll just put a couple extra hours in after 5. Some people don't give them that time back, right? It's not like the next morning I'm going to then clock in at 11 because if you're trying to outweigh that or balance it, I feel like you do have a manager that's online and sometimes, you have these workplaces where they do look at your online status and things like that.
Mm,
Not all the
mm.
time, but if you're constantly putting in these extra hours after work and then clocking in later, I don't think that they're going to think that's okay, even though they say it's flexible. So then back to my point, you're putting in this extra time, but then you're still expected to clock in at the same time each day. And that's what it should be, right? That's what we're contracted to do. We're contracted to work 8 to 4, 9 to 5. So I mean, although it's flexible, sometimes I do think there's weeks where I give a bit more and then maybe I never get it back in return. And that's just every workplace I've been at, right? That's not down to one select one. And then I guess that time to relax, reset, you don't get it. And then it probably goes back into feeling burnt out, feeling unmotivated, lack of passion for the job that you're doing. I mean, something that I would love to get your thoughts on as well is these sick days that we get at work. A lot of the time, one thing about mental illness is that essentially it's invisible. You can't see it, right? So when we feel as though we just need a day to take because we're just having a week, we're overworked, we're feeling whatever way we're feeling, why is it up to the individual manager? And why isn't it a company-wide policy that an individual should be allowed to take mental health days as per their sick leave? And why is there a bit of a stigma on, unless I can hear you cough, unless you pick up the phone and I can hear your voice is a bit bad or you've sneezed every few seconds, it's a bit weird for you to take this day off because you seem fine.
Yeah, I think the key here is where you mention you seem fine because your physical exterior is you're not coughing, your eyes aren't watery, you are fine to the naked eye. But how do we actually explain how you're mentally feeling and what does mental illness look like? Because mental illness has many different shapes and sizes depending on the person and the circumstances affecting that individual. I think it's something that maybe it's a generational divide, and there's many different factors at play here. The first thing I would say is for our generation, Gen Z, we've been brought up around talking about mental health is acceptable and it's welcomed, where if you are struggling, this is where you can go to get support. So that's something that as I've grown up and you've grown up, we get taught it at school. So when we enter the workplace, we don't feel like there is as much stigma around it, where we can say like, oh, I'm not feeling too good today. You know, I've got external pressures or factors. I need to take a sick day and it's a mental health day. I think from my experience, where the concern can be is a generational above manager that has an expectation that you're working through it. And it's this toughen it up mentality that I think isn't a one size fits all. And I'm sure we'll get into it throughout this episode. There are situations where, yes, you do need to push through a little bit more. But there are times where, as you say, just because you don't see it doesn't mean they're not feeling that way. And maybe we can be a little bit more acceptable of the situation and not have that individual, as you mentioned, feel shamed or feel guilty for needing or wanting to take a mental health day. I think if you take a sick day, no one should question why. I think the issue would then be if you're taking consecutive sick days, it should be on your manager to have a conversation with you and say, hey, you've been taking a lot of sick days. Is there something I can support you with? And framing the conversation around that instead of, why are you taking so many sick days? This is unacceptable. You can't be doing this anymore. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting one because the question I always ask myself and think about is how much should you be opening up to your manager about mental health and your personal journey with mental health? Because one, to your point about generations and the generations above us, and without sounding like I am coming for the older generations, I think that they did grow up on a era where you just have to toughen up. You know, no, you're not feeling like this. Go to bed, wake up, you're refreshed. Not saying that's a bad thing because sometimes you do need a bit of tough love and sometimes that's what it takes. However, there are instances where you are going through something that is so persistent and repeated that it really does punch you in the gut and punch you down, right? We are more open to that as a generation. And I have an example where I've got a close friend at work who probably is someone who is a lot more open about their mental health, which I think's really great. And this is with their manager. I think that's so, so great. However, I don't think that their manager is as reciprocal to receiving that and open to hearing it, which is really sad to hear and see. And that's maybe, like you said, a generational divide. So I guess it's all about, my thought on it is give them enough for them to understand that you're going through something, but not enough for that potentially it's ammunition to something that they don't understand and for them to create their own narrative about what's going on. Because at the end of the day, it's your business, right? But I don't think that you should hide it so much that it then affects your work and you're not able to give a reason as to why.
Mm. Yeah, I think when it starts to impact your work and the conversation hasn't been had before, that's where the challenges can occur. Like I sort of put my manager's hat on, and I think if I have a colleague and all of a sudden their work quality's declined and they're taking more sick days, there's clearly something going on there. So if I was the manager, what can I do to support them? Unfortunately, not every single manager thinks that way. And when
For
I
sure.
go back to the example I brought up about starting work at 5 o'clock in the morning, sometimes finishing at 7, 8, 9, 10, that's not sustainable. And just because you, as the manager, choose to live your life that way and wake up at a certain time, you can't force that expectation on everybody else. And also, you mentioned it, and it was a really good point earlier in this episode. Your level should determine your work output. So if you're being paid at a certain level, you hold certain responsibilities. And I hate when you have this expectation that you might have to work as hard or as many hours as someone 2, 3 levels above you making 120, 30, 40 plus $1,000. You know, there are points where your level of authority and seniority reflect the pay packet you're getting. But at the same time, everybody needs to have sustainable working conditions. So I think one thing we can move on to now are some practical strategies that people can put into their own workplace or their own life to manage burnout. And when we were talking about episode planning, this was a topic you were really passionate on. So I'd love to draw from your experience here and help the listener with your experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, mental health and something I've learned, especially when it comes to psychologists and therapists, is that we do have resources and we shouldn't be afraid to use them. When I first got introduced to the world of therapy, it wasn't anything to do with work, but I can see now the benefits of when I do go, there is a lot of times where we do talk about work. So, what I would first and foremost say is that there are sometimes works, especially when you're in the private sector, where they have schemes that are free and available for you to use to talk to people. And I actually remember would have been like years ago. I actually used this service at work because at the time I had a horrible boss to the point that I would go to bed crying myself to sleep, like wake up with panic attacks. I couldn't sleep. You think about scenarios, and it's not feeling psychologically safe. That's what it came down to. So I broached with this system, and she was great. There was nothing wrong with it. It was over the phone, and so I do feel like I didn't get the connection as much as I would have liked. Now, that form of communication might work for people, but for me, it just didn't. She was great. She remembered a lot of things, which I really appreciated. It made me feel like she was listening, but I don't know if I loved it that much. Maybe I should have shopped around for someone else to speak to. I'm not saying that it's a bad kind of system, and sometimes that's all we can afford. So I would say broach that. The next thing I would say is probably reaching out to your GP. Now, I will say if you feel as though that you can't speak to your GP about something like this and about, what their recommendations are on speaking to a psychologist or getting a mental health plan, I don't think that they're the best GP for you. Controversial, but you should be able to speak to your GP about absolutely everything, and they should be able to support what you need. So then I would go to your GP, ask for a mental health plan. They'll probably ask you what is going on, and you do need to fill out a bit of a questionnaire and speak to them about how you're feeling, and then they will probably recommend a couple psychologists for you. My biggest tip for this is if you don't feel as though you like the first one, don't stay. Move on to the next person and don't feel bad about it. You can always cancel an appointment over the phone and just make an excuse like you will reschedule it and just never do it. Because I know from my experience, things like that, you always feel a little bit bad to do. I had one therapist and then she was fine. Nothing bad, but probably just not the one for me. And I reckon from when I had that session with her to when I went to my next therapist was over a year. And that was just me putting it off because I didn't have a great experience. I really want to push and provoke for you to not leave that amount of time between it. Just go back to your GP and find someone else or get them to recommend someone else, or reach out to your network and friends. The reason I see the therapist I do is because I had a friend who her therapist recommended this place for me, and she is absolutely unreal. She unfortunately went on maternity leave, and she asked me what I want in a therapist because she's going to recommend someone new for me. And I told her, and she said, well, that's exactly what I want in a client. And when she said that to me, I thought, we never ask or find out what they want because it should be two-way. And what I will say is that it's definitely really life-changing. You need to be open to speaking about more than you anticipate to go into talking about, because you do feel as though you have this one issue, but everything stemmed from one thing. And
Mm,
it's definitely a great outlet if you just want to talk. My advice is just, even if you don't feel comfortable speaking to someone in the professional field or going to that formal extent, just tell one person in your life what you're going through. Just one,
mm.
whether that's a close friend, a parent. I guarantee that will alleviate everything you're feeling by 50%.
Hearing you talk about that was interesting. What makes a good therapist? Because I'm thinking about it from the listener point of view, and I haven't gone to therapy. I feel like in my own life, I haven't been in a situation where I've needed to, but I think it's a really valuable tool. And not just when I speak to you outside of this podcast, but other people that I know and previous work colleagues who have been to therapy, they mentioned that they went to a few therapists before they found one that stuck with them. So when you do choose to go to therapy, what's something that you would encourage the listener to look out for?
I will say mental health and therapy is all everyone's individual unique experience, right? What I like and what I look for might be different to the next person. So just acknowledge that and take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. But for me, it's someone who, if, for example, if I was to say to you, this thing happened at work and it was so frustrating and this person did XYZ, I love a therapist who goes, that is so annoying. Yeah, I hate that. Like, comes back, is part of the conversation. Something else I love is when they remember something else and I'm talking about something completely different and they'll go, oh, yeah, like that other time. And so
Mm,
it's a feeling of that they're listening because they make notes. And something that I really love the most is that when you go to therapy, you go with things that are wrong and you forget to reflect on your achievements and what you actually have accomplished and the positives in a situation. So, what I love is when I am doing that and she'll check me and she'll go, hang on, let's take a step back and realize you actually got to XYZ. That's actually a positive. This person's actually telling you that they validating what you're saying, whatever it is. So that would be mine. I think for me, I like it in person. So I think that's really important. Someone who has a really nice space that's, nice and bright, really approachable, asks the right questions. But again, I really will emphasize that what I like might not be the same and right for someone else.
yeah, of course. There's no one size fits all, as we've said about mental health. So the other question I have then is when you see therapists on movies and TV, it's painted as you walk in, it's a dimly lit room. You sit on one side of the couch, they're on another side of the couch, and you might be lying upside down looking at the roof. How accurate is that? And what is it actually like when you do go to therapy?
Well, it's not dim. I mean, the experience that I've had is it's quite well lit, very well air conditioned. I think that it's, I mean, in movies, they need to emphasize the feeling, right? So they're going to emphasize what the space looks and feels, but it's really not like that. I will say there are some practices that they will do on you, and sometimes that does require you to lie down. And, you can say if you're comfortable to do that or not. I know a couple of friends who have done a couple of hypnosis and things like that too, which is a form of therapy, which does require you to, be lying down or seated in a different position. So yes, there's elements, but it's not as scary and as grim as it makes it look on TV shows and movies.
And since you have been going to therapy, you mentioned that you initially went because you were needing a little bit of support with the situation you were in at work at that current point in time. Two questions. Since that point in time, has therapy given you the right resources to navigate future situations? And with where you are in your life right now, how frequent are your therapy visits? Because I imagine the listener and my own thinking is if you go to therapy, you obviously want support. You don't want to be going all the time. You need to be given the skills and the resources to learn with how you're feeling and navigate those feelings in a, well educated way. So, from your experience, how do you address those 2 points?
I mean, the first thing I would say is what has made a big difference in my therapy sessions is actually giving it the space to talk about it. When we feel a certain way, we almost bottle it up and we think about it. But unless you verbalize it, you can't come to terms with how you're actually feeling about it. And so, although I might not have any formal practices in that I take back to the workplace, I think what has been really valuable is really just having a space to speak about it and someone else validate how frustrating and upsetting it is, whether it is a work thing, whether it's not a work thing. I will say there are a couple things that I have put in place and that have been recommended by my therapist that are just working for me, such as every time I feel a bit of anxiety or stress, I write it down. And then between my then and my next therapy session, we read them all out and then we just laugh about it because they are such
Mm,
small things in that moment. Because from the time it happened to when you think about it, generally the issue isn't an issue and it's solved. And we laugh because it's just crazy that in that moment that was the biggest thing on your mind. And that's
yeah.
something I really enjoyed and get exciting writing down. But now I get to a point where when it happens, I think about that feeling of how small it actually is that I go, oh yeah, well, I'm just gonna give that the 2 second it deserves and then move on.
Mm. Isn't it
And
funny
then
how the human brain tries to just talk up a situation to protect you? You know,
mhm.
you in that moment felt like it was the most important, biggest thing, and you maybe have gone into like a fight or flight response. And then after the dust has settled, as you say, you go and you talk about your experience with your therapist and you laugh about it because it's not a big deal at all. So that's a great insight because as someone who at times does struggle with overthinking, it's not until after the fact, and maybe I've spoken to you or my partner or whoever else, you go, actually wasn't that big of a deal. But for you, you're constantly taking that proactive approach and you're recognizing the signs and the factors that are influencing why you might be thinking that way or feeling that way. So that's really great that you're able to share that experience with us.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, another piece of advice that I would say is that when we are at work, I know that there's so many moments that I go home and I don't know if you've seen these memes where you're like in the car and you're pretending how you would say a certain situation again, or you're like screaming in your pillow because you're cringing from stuff you said at work. No one is thinking about what you're saying and what you've done because they're all thinking about themselves. They're moving on to the next email. They're moving on to the next meeting. Their mindset, or at least in my workplace, we're going 100 miles per hour and it's just moving forward. No one ever stops to thinking about that one instance where maybe you stuttered a word or maybe you dropped something and it was embarrassing. No one cares. And if you are able to make like a joke about it and laugh about it, then people will react based on how you react to it. I think also just to add to your previous question on cadence and how often I go to therapy, I currently go once a month or once every 6 weeks. And that is because honestly, financially, that is what works for me and what works for what I need. I will say at the start, it was probably a lot more frequent, but I was just open with my therapist on, look, like it is quite expensive and this is what I can do and achieve. And if they are understanding, which they should be, that shouldn't be an issue. In Australia, we do get a mental health plan that unlocks 10 sessions that are reimbursed, not the whole amount, but you do get a certain amount back. And after 6 sessions, that your GP just has to do a little bit of a review, send it to your psych for you to unlock the last four. So it is a program that I really recommend people use because it is almost free in the sense you can do that as long as you have a mental health plan. So I really, really would emphasize using that, because the next thing I want to talk about and go into is the rise of TikTok therapists. I want to
Yeah.
know if you have heard about this term.
Yeah. So when we were planning for this episode, you kept bringing up that you want to talk about TikTok therapists. And
Yeah.
as someone who isn't on TikTok and will only be on TikTok for the No Censorship podcast, I had no idea what you're talking about. So yeah, go for it. What is a TikTok therapist?
So a TikTok therapist is a content creator, often with no clinical credentials or degrees or anything, that basically posts content to scale that is around medical kind of advice, right? Something to think about, because there's probably listeners as well that potentially do know what it means and go, yeah, of course. Like, I listen to my TikTok therapist all the time, which is very normal. I hear the phrase, my TikTok therapist said this, XYZ. Let's just remember that they don't have access to any of your health records. They don't, they're not giving you customary advice. They don't know what you've been through. They are talking on basically making something up that one shoe fits all. And a good example of this is this horoscope effect or psychic effect. And I don't know if you've heard about that. Have you heard of that?
No. So paint the picture on what the type of content is, because it's
Mhm.
interesting you're going to talk about this aspect of horoscopes because you are a horoscope person. So for you to come out and critique it a little bit, I'm starting to think, where is this going to go?
I horoscopes, and my opinion on it is one for a different episode, but I agree. This part of it is where I do not agree. And that is, the horoscope effect is essentially when you just see on your timeline someone in that field basically saying, thank you for joining. If you've joined and you have someone in your family that has the letter E in their name, and you saw a tree on the way to work, and you bumped into a number plate that had three sevens in it and saw this car, and it's a like, the chances of you doing that is 80%. Of course you would see that. So then as a
Mm.
listener, you go, oh my God, they must be so real because they've claimed that. So, for example, a TikTok therapist might go, if you're not feeling productive today and you didn't do much, you've got ADHD. Because of
Wow. So
course
they
that
actually try to diagnose people.
well, because that's a symptom, right? But if you're not having a productive day, there are so many other factors that could contributed to that. I
Yeah,
will
that's
say
right.
on the other side of it, TikTok has helped some people. I know that we've seen comments where people have commented about children and said, hey, you should go check that mole on your back or that kid's thing. And it has helped. But those are the really, really rare cases, right? What is scary is that about 1 in 6 Gen Zs use TikTok as their primary search engine tool for health, for health
Mm.
answers and questions. So we're using a platform where their majority of the time isn't these health experts, or they don't know you enough to know what advice to give you. And we're using that as gospel and as Bible. And that's what's kind of scary to me, and why we're probably normalizing. I'm all for normalizing mental health, and we should. And it's so great that this generation is. But now this is going back to the root of what this topic is are we overdoing it? Are we overdiagnosing? Are we using it as a bit of a scapegoat? I mean, you hear
Yeah.
terms like, oh, we trauma bonded, I'm being gaslit, they're a narcissist, as terms that are clinical terms, but they're used for everyday open conversation. And I know
And
what you
people
mean by
might not
that.
know what it is.
Exactly. But they're health terms. They're not terms that should just be used to say, yeah, that's so traumatic, which it is, or I have PTSD. But do we really know what PTSD is? Why are we just making this term okay, like a general word that we're just using to describe things?
the commonality of something diminishes its impact. So when so many people are coming out and saying, I have PTSD, I have ADHD, I have such and such, well, if so many people are saying it, it can make others feel like, well, either A, this is such a minuscule mental illness because every single person has it. And when I look at you, you're fine. You're just
Mm.
having it as a behavioral characteristic of yourself. Or the other option is, what is the root problem of this? Why are so many people feeling like they have PTSD or ADHD? As we're talking about this, I see it as a big concern for those who genuinely have PTSD or ADHD or another form of mental illness, because it can be
Mhm,
discredited when so many other people are saying that they have it. And this person
mhm,
might be feeling like, I'm really struggling. People don't understand how I'm feeling, especially with PTSD. I do a lot of work with former veterans. And that is a huge issue in the veteran community. Once they transition
mhm,
out of service, the things that they've seen and, everything that comes with the impact of that life of service in that job,
mhm.
it can be seen as diminished if other people are saying, oh, I've got PTSD because I did something so minuscule. And obviously there's a scale, right? Maybe you could have a form of PTSD, but the severity of it is where it changes. So I think being aware of it and, as you say, maybe not listening to your TikTok therapist and seeking out a real therapist who can actually help navigate how you're feeling in a proactive way.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I completely agree, and I think this is a great platform to kind of make people aware. And I do want to say, we're not trying to make someone feel less than if they do believe in this stuff, because it's not something that we can control, but just being aware of that someone else actually might be going through something like that, that is a bit more serious. For me, I kind of want to change and shift gears a little bit back into this like burnout culture. I don't know if you've heard, and I'm keen to hear if you've heard of this hustle culture versus soft life phenomenon that's kind of taken over TikTok. I think hustle culture we'll probably heard a lot about, but soft life, I don't know if you've heard that term.
Yeah, I have. So I've actually got a little bit of research on this topic.
Okay.
So, as you said, we are seeing the rise of hustle culture, but maybe people don't know what it is. So, it's a mindset glorifying relentless hard work and believing that pushing yourself without boundaries is the ultimate key to success. And what we're seeing is it's typically impacting younger individuals to be more motivated by external factors, and it's typically being used on social media. So it's seen as money and status are actually what gives you value instead of the value that you may get from your core values as a human being. So
Mhm.
without the fancy house, the fancy car, the ripped body, you don't have as much self worth as someone who has those things. And it's really detrimental to the image of, young people and their mental health. What I have found interesting is we talk about hustle culture being bad and there are extremes to it. But I think there are circumstances where people don't push beyond the boundaries that they're capable of. Just
Mhm.
recently, I finished reading Ned Brockman's book, where he explains how he went from uh, a kid studying to eventually running from Perth to Bondi to support homelessness in Australia. And there are days where he's talking about how he can barely run and his ankles are so swollen and his joints are hurting so bad. But he ends up running another 100 kilometers and then does it again the next day. And as I was reading this book, I kept thinking any sane person would stop. Your body's telling you to stop. But he's the perfect example of pushing beyond your body's limits and getting to the end, not completely injury free, but he survived it. So I think a lot of people go to two extremes and maybe there's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I love that. I think to kind of piggyback on what you said, there's some skills like ambition, discipline that we really can learn from hustle culture, right? There's some things that come out of it that's good. But then when we start getting influenced by those drop ship now, this is how to make money fast, we'll make you rich, pyramid
Mm.
schemes, hustle, hustle, hustle. That's when the lines are blurred because to me, that's not hustle culture or that's not hustling or doing good for you. That's just a whole other extreme. And what you're going after actually in that is money. You're not going after a passion or a dream. For me, hustle, ambition, and discipline is because you're passionate about something and you care about it. And yes, monetary value is maybe a byproduct of it, but it's not your number one thing.
No. And I think that's where the lines get blurred. And I think about
Mhm.
when me and you really wanted to set up this podcast, we both still have a full-time job and we're doing this on the side because we're genuinely passionate about what we're trying to create and the topics that we're discussing because we feel like that there's a gap in the information being shared here. And if we want to listen to it, hopefully other people do as well. Where I see the main concern is people looking at social media and then automatically assuming if you can do that, I can do that too. But social media only paints one side of the picture. So
Mm,
if you are wanting to go and hustle, and I do encourage anyone out there to better themselves and strive for the most success that they can have, but do it in a clear and purposeful way.
mm,
Outline what your goals are, outline what you want to achieve, and put the necessary steps in there in a healthy way to achieve it. So for us, if we're talking about the podcast example, we've been talking about bringing this back since September. This is not some overnight thing. We would have a phone call, we set out what we wanted to do, we redid our strategy, etc., and eventually got to the point where we're recording again and publishing clips and being in your ears again. But that overnight success isn't true. And I know you're reading a book at the moment about, chasing your dream. So I'd love to hear what other influencers are saying about this topic.
yeah, I mean, it's a good one too. And if we anchor back on burnout, I think something that we've said to begin with, especially because this is on the side, is just constantly making sure that we're checking in with each other to make sure that we're not overdoing it and that we're burnt out. And one thing I love about us, and obviously this is a bit of a different example because this is our own thing, but we are constantly one checking in on each other. And two, if I'm like, look, I have a headache tonight, I really can't, you're not taking it as I'm lazy or that I don't want to do it. You're always so respectful and responsive and like, yeah, take the night, rest, do what you need, and vice versa. And I think that's something that I love about and what it should be when it comes to work is that you should be able to identify, and whoever you are speaking to and reporting to, is that they also understand that we are people with lives outside of it and we need to have a break and we need to stop. The counter argument, obviously, to hustle culture is this soft life that everyone's trying to achieve. And that's something else that's been trending on TikTok or Instagram or socials. And it's, yeah, the counter movement of basically prioritizing your rest and your comfort and under the crux of the fact that you don't owe the economy more and your work more than what they're paying you. And that's something that we kind of started the episode talking about, right? So I think in this one, it's all about normalizing 9 to 5 and putting in clear boundaries and saying, you know what, I'm doing what I've been. If you pulled up my position description, that is what I'm doing. I'm not doing more than that. I'm clocking off at a hard 5, at a hard whatever it is. I'm prioritizing my health and my life outside of it. And honestly, I really do respect that. And I know some people who are really ambitious and disciplined might go, no, but you need to work hard. But I also do think that there is time for play and there's time for you outside of work. I mean, a question that I love, and you explained this to me years ago really well, is work to live or live to work. And maybe
Mm.
you can give the listener a little bit of a definition what that is. And I guess what stance and the argument you are, because I think it all comes down to that, right?
Yeah, and I think it's so key. The main factor here is everyone's circumstances are different. The first thing I want to touch on is I like that we are mentioning normalizing the 9 to 5 because I see so often young influencers saying, I hate the 9 to 5. I don't want to be stuck in the 9 to 5 grind. You're not going to catch me doing that. I'm going to strive for success. And I get that. Please strive for success. But having a 9 to 5 job or an 8 to 4 job, a steady income job, is so important in society. And I don't want us to discredit or devalue those individuals with that job or those striving to have that job. Because at the end of the day, society revolves around everyone contributing. And we do need those people who have an 8 to 4, a 9 to 5. When we look back on the history of workers' rights, people fought to have the working conditions that we have now. So
Mm,
when young people are saying, I just don't want to work a 9 to 5, like that's perfectly fine. But maybe it's because you want to realign with something else. And that's okay. But just be mindful that you're discrediting the actual 9 to 5 job itself. And
yeah.
then going back on what you just asked me, do we work to live or live to work? I feel like that's pretty self-explanatory, right? Experiences will always be with you throughout your life. And when there are those people who have asked people who are close to death what their biggest regret is, no one ever says that they wish they worked more. Most
Mm,
commonly, they say, I wish I spent more time with my family or I wish I traveled, because those life experiences are the things that you will carry with your life all the way to
mm.
the very end. Money comes, money goes, and your happiness is the most important thing at the end of the day.
Absolutely. I think what I've loved seeing as well, something trending at the moment is doing something after work during the week because you're not living for the weekend. And I think that's the kind of cycle we get into. And that's why people start getting burnt out, is because they don't have something to look forward to after 5. And I will say, gym does not count. Your gym is a stress reliever, but it is one thing to do for well-being. There should be
Mm,
something else that is something you're passionate about, grateful for, or something you want to experience, whether it's art, whether it's, a sport, whatever that looks like, whether it's just constantly checking out new restaurants with friends, whatever that looks like, it should be that. And that's what we should be putting in on a Thursday, a Tuesday, so that you have something to look forward to. And I guarantee, to your point, when you look back on life, those are the things you're going to remember. You're not going to remember, you might negatively remember that you put in more hours and didn't really get more out of it. And I think this goes back as well down to that soft life, silent quitting phenomenon. I don't know if you've heard of that, where people, they're not quitting for real, but they're not going above and beyond anymore. And it comes down
mm,
to this burnt out mentality, because I think the crux of it is that we're just not getting recognition. We're not getting enough recognition and reward for the hard work that we put in. But instead of how we're getting rewarded is, you're doing a good job, here, have more work. So then we
yeah.
have this conflict with ourselves. And it's like, well, why am I being rewarded for doing what I'm supposed to be doing in getting overworked?
Mm. This is actually going to be something we're talking about in our next episode. And this has actually happened to me last week, where me and my colleague are doing really good work at the moment. And we've actually been given more work on top of that. And we're not being
Mm,
financially compensated. So we're actually doing someone else's job who can't do it. And they're a level above us. And their work's now being given to us, which I don't think is fair. But
mm,
that is a conversation for the next episode. So for the listeners, you're getting a small tease of what we're going to be moving into for the next episode. But just to close it up, I think we've had a really impactful conversation about burnout, mental health, seeking therapy, and putting the right practices in place to get the right support that you need. I love how you've mentioned not living for the weekend and putting things in place throughout the work week that actually get you excited and actually give you something to look forward to, because every single day above ground is a blessing. Live that day to the fullest. You've got your
Mm,
work hours, which is 8 to 4, 9 to 5, whatever it may be. Outside of those hours, you've got so much time to go and do things. And I get that there may be people who have families and things like that, but don't use that as an excuse. If you do have kids, go with them to the park or take them for a walk. Like, just do something to be present in the moment and something that will help fill your cup, because long term, you're going to be seeing the mental health benefits from that. And you're actually going to be looking forward to your life a lot more than just another day of work, living for the weekend. You keep living for the weekend, you're missing out on living in the moment right now. So those are my final thoughts. If you have
yeah.
any, would love to hear them.
I mean, I love that. I think what you really emphasized is it's the small changes that matter, right? We're not sitting here saying put something in after work every single day because that's going to contribute more to your burnout. It's the small changes. It's telling one person how you're feeling if you're not feeling right. It's reaching out to your GP and understanding what resources that you have available. I mean, something that I love, which is the counter argument, maybe, or maybe something that we can look up to as an example, is Finland. They're the happiest country in the world, number one. We're number 10 for context. And we come out of number 10 within the cohort from that are Gen Z. So we're out of the top 10. Some of the things that they're doing are so simple, which is free university, universal health care. They've got generous parental leave, reasonable work hours, really strong support systems. People are saying in Finland that if they were in a crisis, they have at least minimum 3 people that they could go to. Can we
Mm,
say that for ourselves with where we are and where we work? Can we do that? So I mean, something for us to think about and look at is I would love to challenge people to have a bit of self awareness and sit back and go, am I sad? Am I depressed? Am I anxious? And how much percentage is your workplace contributing to that? And if it is that, what can you do to help get out of that? Because we don't deserve that. We deserve to go to work, to feel happy, to feel passionate, and at the end of the day, to make an income so we can do other things in our world and provide for maybe people in our life.
mm. Yeah, I've really loved having this conversation with you today. So just to close it off, as always, real conversations deserve real space. So we really appreciate each and every single one of you who have made it up to this point and have been part of the conversation with us. So while the episode may be finishing, we don't want the conversation to end here. We want to hear your thoughts in the comment section below, wherever you might be listening, and engage with us on social media. And if there is a topic that you think you'd want to hear us talk about, let us know. Our inbox is open and we would love to have a conversation with you and hear what you want us to talk about, because we want this podcast to be as beneficial as it is for us, as it is for you. So thank you once again, and we will catch you on the next episode.